All right, in lesson number 3, we are going to be talking about how to actually apply the stain. And most of what I'm going to be discussing in this lesson relates to skull carving. So a lot of the stains that you are going to be applying will be the surface stains, which means you're going to need some brushes. Don't get too picky on this. Use whatever you want. I use a variety of brushes and a variety of quality of brushes as well. A side note, you can simply clean your brushes with acetone. That works really well. Or you can take the brush, put it in a Ziploc bag and put it in the freezer, and that will keep the brush from drying out. Some of the solutions you will be working on can stain your hands a lot, so I do recommend using gloves when appropriate with some of those stains. Now, although we did already cover submerging skulls in a penetrating solution, I did want to reiterate that you never want to boil a skull. I know there's a lot of information out there, there's a lot of different views on that, but just take it from me, especially with the staining, do not boil the skulls. Always take the solution off of the burner, let it sit for a little bit, and then put your skull in the solution. Now, a big issue with staining a carved skull a lot of the times is that when you put the stain on, it goes on unevenly and it soaks into the bone, it leaches into the area around the carved area that you've exposed. Now, I cover the skull with a clear coat first, and that way it fills in the rough areas, all the little pores in the skull, so that when you put the stain on, the stain doesn't soak into the bone, but stays and remains a surface stain. Now, I specifically use a UV protective clear coat so that it does not yellow over time. I use Krylon. There are other options out there. And do be liberal with that first clear coat that you put on. That way it will soak into all those porous areas of the skull. And a glossy coat is best for that first one. Even if you don't want a glossy look in the end, later on in the process, you're going to wipe most of that clear coat off anyhow. But a glossy helps to wipe off the stain when we apply it. Now, you've got your carving, you've already put a clear coat onto it, and then you're going to apply your stain. Generally speaking, applying a stain is to kind of highlight, to put the focus on the area that you've carved. So you're just going to take that stain, wipe it on, make sure it gets in all the little crevices really well, and then come back with a rag and wipe off the excess stain. You will notice there will be some slight stain on the areas around your carving, but just leave that for now, let it dry, and then what we're going to do is we're going to come back later and we're going to do one of two things. Either take nail polish remover, specifically gel nail polish remover, and take a rag and wipe off the excess stain that's on the areas around your carving, or take a piece of sandpaper and lightly sand and the area around the carving, and that will get rid of that excess stain. Now, what I will do a lot of times with a carved skull is, in addition to staining the area that I've carved, I will take that stain and stain the rest of the skull and then wipe off the excess stain. And what that does is it creates either like a old look to the skull, like the carving has been a part of the skull for a while, or it creates more of a washed out look, just depending again on the kind of the vibe, the look that you're going for. You can layer stains to some extent. What I will do a lot of the times is I put on my clear coat, I will add a dark stain to my carving to highlight the carving itself. I will then put another clear coat on so that when I come back with the second stain, it doesn't mix with the first stain that I put on. So I put a second clear coat on after the first layer of stain, and then I will put a stain on the entire skull, a surface stain, to kind of pull everything together and give it a look depending on, again, what I'm going for. Now, I did want to touch on all natural colors that you're going to make yourself, such as a berry, a blueberry, blackberry. Colors will fade over time, so especially natural colors. So what I do is I use a fixative to help maintain the color of those stains. And to do that, you just take some warm water, you mix in the appropriate amount of fixative into the water. You're going to soak the skull in that water for a period of time. It's usually like 20 minutes or so. Just follow the directions for whatever fixative you get, and then let the skull dry before you move on to the next step of sealing the skull. Now, another kind of preventive measure to keep a surface stain from seeping into the bone is to lightly sand the skull beforehand. So after you've done all your preparations and you have a clean skull, this works especially better with larger skulls like a cow skull, where you have a larger surface area to work with. If the area is really rough, start with some sandpaper. Don't be too aggressive, but just sand it down enough so that the surface becomes fairly smooth. That will help the clear coat go on and fill in the porous areas, and it just creates less of a surface, less rough areas for that stain to get stuck in. So just to review, say you're carving a cow skull, you've started with a nice clean skull, you've done your carving, you're going to come across with a light sanding to smooth out any rough areas. You're going to put on a liberal coat, clear coat, a UV protective coat. Then you're going to come back with your stain. You may do several layers of stain depending on the project, the particular skull that you're working on. And then at that point, you move on to the next step of sealing the skull.